Hi, this is Professor Anderson, and welcome back to United States history from 1877 to the present. Thank you so much for your patience as I start getting these lectures up on the web. I have not yet figured out how you can both see my face and see the slides, and so we're doing just slides at this point. And then you might notice if you get directed to my YouTube channel that there's also a whole bunch of lectures up there, and there will be more for my SPC classes. So make sure that you're looking at the appropriate slides for the appropriate class. At the end of the last class, we were talking about the ways in which the existence of World War II was dramatically transforming the lives of American individuals even before the United States was formally part of the war. In particular, we were looking at the ways that the civilian population was changed and finding new pathways according to the restrictions of race and class. We looked first at the notion of the double victory campaign. So African Americans who were drafted or who enlisted as part of the American military, trying to make the claim that excellent participation as members of the military might someday be something they could leverage in order to challenge segregation in the United States. A lot of those soldiers were going to places that weren't segregated and where they were treated as Americans in a good way. And so the experience of coming home was kind of going to be unsettling. But in the meantime, the ways that the home front was shifting during World War II were already making a big difference. So soldiers' hopes essentially were not naive. Lockheed Aircraft began integrating its workforce in 1941. Quickly followed by all West Coast naval and aviation construction plants, and that's a big flourishing new business. With word of work in California, more than about 340,000 African Americans moved to LA between 1942 and 1945. This is the era in which Los Angeles starts to look like Los Angeles and be a real city. Same with San Diego. Part of it is because of everything that's happening out there with aeronautics and with ship construction. So there's a total of about 400,000 African Americans who moved from the South to the West during this era. And for the people who made this move, their wages did go up as a result. And yet, still, those wages were about 65% of what most white workers made. So this was an improvement, but still far from equity. And on the other hand, you have the unique circumstances of Mexicans and Mexican Americans during the war. So I'm going to switch slides now. So having deported many Mexicans and Mexican Americans during the Depression, the United States government was now in a really weird, awkward sort of situation, which was that they needed agricultural laborers. They needed laborers because Americans who otherwise might have filled these positions had been drafted. And so the United States government set up what was called the Bracero Program, in which the Mexican government agreed to permit emigration to the United States in exchange for promises of fair wages and adequate housing and medical care. So most Mexican families working in the U.S. nonetheless received less than U.S. minimum wage, and they were traveling generally not with their families because it was for the agricultural workers alone. But nonetheless, it made a significant difference, and a lot of these people wound up staying. Remember, we were talking about with Mexican immigration to the United States that it's kind of a constant, ongoing process. It doesn't have the distinctive waves that Chinese immigration or Japanese immigration or immigration that's driven by a revolution necessarily has. So the camps themselves that people were working in included conditions that most of us would find unacceptable, including things like, if you look at the top of the right corner, the just spraying of human beings with DDT, which is, of course, the pesticide in the 1970s and 1980s, which turns out to have all sorts of implications. For agricultural laborers, the lifespan typically is in the late 40s during this era. So this is difficult work. It's work that's done by poor immigrants, and it's work in which the working conditions themselves are dangerous to the point of limiting lifespan. That's not a phenomenal combination of elements. Now, against this trend, you have a whole previous generations of Mexican Americans who very much identify with the United States and have in fact really come to take on its culture and have a significant role in that. Their families might have been here for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, or they could have been part of the group that lived there even before California or Arizona was part of the United States. So for many of these people who absolutely identify as part of the American working class or middle class, one of the ways that they most commonly showed their style was through the zoot suit. So if you look at like the photo on the top, you have these long pants with all of this extra fabric. And the fabric itself was seen as really provocative because during World War II, the United States was rationing fabric. And so the wearing of this apparel was a way to make a particular claim within the country. It was a provocative sort of claim. And at a certain point, you have a lot of violence that came as a result of the conflict in how two different groups of people saw this particular apparel. And the zoot suit started to take on its own sort of life, quite apart from the superficialities of fashion. It became kind of an anti-establishment sort of garment, to the point that here you can see at a Japanese-American internment camp in Tule Lake. On the left side, you can see the young men all wearing zoot suit style pants as a way to kind of showcase their coolness. Or on the bottom right corner, where you have a very famous, because it's one of the few photos of a young Malcolm X wearing the same sort of thing. So upon entry, the American home front went through some pretty arbitrary forms of discrimination, a lot of fear, and a lot of hardships. And it was unlike World War I in that rationing became pretty common, not just fabric, but also things like sugar. You might remember me talking in class about why my dad won't eat rhubarb as we go into our traditional spring vegetables, because it tastes awful without sugar, and that was the only way that his family had it. They could grow rhubarb wild in their backyard, and so they grew rhubarb, and it really tastes awful without sugar. It's like cranberries without sugar. Like, it just does not taste good at all. So to this day, my father will not eat rhubarb. But by far the greatest hardship, of course, is a loss of life. Okay. Oh, I had an additional slide about women in industry. So there were women in industry. Okay, so here's the simplified timeline of World War I. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about loss of life. So if you want to, you can pause and take notes on this really quickly. Okay, so loss of life. So in the United States, people tried to express their understanding of what was happening, right, through a star system, which was that each household would actually post in the window something that could be seen from the street, a selection of stars that represented how many family members from that household were active members of the military. The blue stars indicated that someone was away, that they were enlisted, and the gold star meant that someone in your household had been killed during wartime. And so this became a very visible display that kept very present the idea of the fatalities as they started to unfold. And there's a few different ways that we can try and understand the meaning of the 420,000 deaths that the United States lost during World War II. One is that we can try and say, okay, what's the context of that in comparison to the rest of the world, right? So there's this one graph. If you might wonder why I'm breezing through it, it's because I have another plan. There's another way in which we could look at how it compares in terms of civilian deaths versus military deaths. So if you look like at this chart, you can tell where the war was because you can see how many civilian deaths were there. You could also think about it in terms of how many deaths were there in this war versus other wars, right? The Civil War is always the highest because on the Civil War, Americans were both sides, right? But then if you look at contemporary figures, much, much lower. I will say that this slide is 3 years dated, so the Afghanistan war, I think we should probably elevate a bit. So that's all true, right? But there's also this quantifiable way that it falls short, right? And we start thinking about qualitative means. And to think about the qualitative meaning of those 240,000 deaths, right, requires the fact that we contemplate for just a minute what it was like to have these particular deaths, right? So it means something different, right? If you die of cancer or from a car accident, or if you die while bungee jumping. It means something different if you die if you're young or if you're old, if you're home or if you're away, or if you're scared and in pain, or if you're surrounded by family and physicians. All of these have different sorts of meanings. So really what you need to get at as a is take a look at this photo just for a couple of minutes and pause the video, and then the video is going to stop. And I want you to ask yourself which role in this entire process you would find the most terrifying, right? Like you can see all of the different people out there, the tight coordination. You can get a sense of the scale of this particular invasion, and think about where is the place that you would least want to be and what are the conditions that you'd find the most terrifying. And I think that that kind of imaginative exercise can really help anchor and help people to understand the meaning of all these deaths, because the numbers are one thing and the numbers have meaning, but it's also the question of the particular way of dying is going to be truly exhausting. In the Normandy invasion, there were at least 10,000 Allied casualties, including 4,000 deaths. The invasion itself was coordinated by General Dwight Eisenhower, whose name you should remember for later. But when we talk about death during World War II, there's also another context that's really relevant. War always means that there's a lot of death, and much of it is civilian, right? It matters how many military deaths and how many civilian deaths and how those two things compare. But World War II was distinct in that the Nazis essentially declared war on a people without an army, Jews and other political ethnic minorities, and then systematically applied all of the resources of an industrialized nation to exterminate these people with maximum efficiency. So if you think about when we were talking about the Progressive Era and how efficiency was really seen as this thing that was good for everybody, here is this dramatic confrontational moment when it becomes extremely clear that it isn't. Okay, and as noted on top, the next slide does have dead bodies. We also have this extremely strange turn of events, right, in which Dachau, which was one of the death camps, was actually liberated in part by the 442nd, right, if you look in the top left corner, which was a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers. So you have this moment of peculiar confrontation in which people who are well aware of what the power, what the abusive power of a centralized nation state can do, right, are seeing the consequences in some cases for that. Now, visitation to and inspection of the concentration camps fell to military authorities. Evidence was photographed and cataloged, living prisoners were interviewed, and Nazi records were collected and reports were filed. And I literally can't think of any other example of a historical event that was documented as thoroughly by both the perpetrators and the discoverers. And yet, somehow now at this moment, troops needed to procure everything that the survivors lacked. So going home for the survivors wasn't really an option, because why would you return to the neighbors who had abandoned and endangered you? And so the military had a job to fill, the Allied military, that it did not plan for and did not always do very well. Not just liberating, but providing for the survivors, reuniting families, and finding new homes for this group of refugees. Again, the military's purpose is to combat another army, another navy, and here they're being asked to immediately pivot and go into a social service role. So Eisenhower, who is present for much of this and who is the author of one of the primary sources we looked at, has really a sort of perfect awareness of exactly the consequences that have happened, right? He is very, very aware. Remember, Eisenhower is also the person who led the invasion in Normandy. I think it bears noting what kind of person Eisenhower is before we even get to the document. Okay, so here is his comments before the Battle of Normandy. Please read through these for a couple minutes. so this puts me in the peculiar question, and I'm now wondering if I'm going to get censored by YouTube for quoting a president of the United States, which, is, I guess, not as surprising as could be, but still surprising. So what I want you to do when you look at the Eisenhower primary source is think about that this is Eisenhower, right? This is the kind of person he is. And this is the person who's writing that letter you read. More than that, if you notice on the discussion board, there's a question asking you to Google, who is Patton? Okay. And I think that knowing that and knowing that reference point is also going to help you really understand that primary source. So what I want you to do is I'm going to read you 2 questions to kind of keep in your mind. And then I want you to, after looking at this slide, contribute to the discussion under the discussion question in Canvas. So the questions I want you to kind of think about just in the back of your head are, what language does Eisenhower use to describe concentration camps? What's distinctive about the nature of his account? And how is it different than what you might expect from somebody who talks like this? The other is, what exactly does Eisenhower propose should happen next and why? Where is he coming from that seems like a sensible solution? And then I want you to make sure you understand who is Patton, this reference point that he's giving that should explain everything else. So at this point, please pause the video, right? And then keep going after you've had an opportunity to contribute to those discussion questions, all the ones about Eisenhower. Okay, the liberation of the concentration camps in turn serves as some context for understanding the meaning of Americans' decision to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The program to build an atomic weapon, the Manhattan Project, had been in process for several years, but remained a closely guarded secret. In fact, at the time of FDR's death in 1945, the vice president, Harry Truman, actually had no idea that a bomb existed. FDR, for all of his attributes, wasn't really good on information sharing. And at that point, he was on his 4th term in office, something that is no longer constitutional, and basically had a tendency to keep things close. Arguably, it would have been better to tell his vice president what was going on. So, and yet, by August, despite the fact that, he had only been president for a couple months, Truman gave the order that 2 of these weapons of mass destruction, untargeted weapons, essentially, should be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so the destruction of all of these and the kind of fallout from dropping these nuclear weapons, really what I want you to do is to think through what exactly this kind of nuclear weaponry means. And I want you to think through it in the context of the essay that you read by John Hersey. Now, John Hersey's essay appeared in the New Yorker, and I also want you to know what that means. So go ahead and take a pause and look at those discussion questions and then come back. I want to speak really quickly about John Hersey's Hiroshima. So what you read for today is a very brief excerpt from an article that was published in the New Yorker and took up virtually the entire magazine for its week, published in commemoration of the 1-year anniversary of the bomb drop. So for that, what I'd really like you to do is first take a moment and go to the discussion section and either contribute to, if you're one of the first, or read what others have written about what was the New Yorker, because you need to know what kind of periodical this is, what kind of magazine it is, what audience you want. So go ahead and pause and take a look at that for a sec. Okay, so this essay was later published as a book. Hersey had been a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter in Europe and Asia during World War II. He wasn't present for the attack, but he based his article upon extensive interviews with numerous survivors. And the ensuing book was popularly explored. It was made into a radio program, and copies of the work were sent free to all members of Book of the Month Club programs, which Book of the Month was like super popular in this era. Now, there was a lot of controversy about what was or wasn't known by whom before the bomb was dropped. As the decades pass and secret papers get gradually released, there's increasing evidence to support the claim that Japan was actually within a few weeks of surrendering, and that American politicians were aware that that surrender was going to happen pretty soon. But there remains unresolved speculation about whether the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki should actually be understood as the first acts of the Cold War, an attempt to show Soviet powers American nuclear capacity. At the time, however, American policymakers asserted that the use of nuclear weapons was perceived as a way to minimize Japanese and U.S. casualties that would have happened if there had been a traditional invasion. We're not so sure about that now, just because it does look like probably, not definitely, but probably Japan was on its way towards surrendering anyway. And in fact, the bombs seem to have been maybe hurried along in order to make sure they happened before that surrender. Historians are also really confused and uncertain about the role of President Truman in this process. Remember, Truman had only become president after Roosevelt, with whom he'd only met a handful of times, died unexpectedly. And Truman didn't know about the existence of the bomb until after he took office. But what we do know is that hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens died, many immediately and many more as the result of the long-term effects of radiation exposure. So what happens is that the nuclear weapons really set a new standard of what mass destruction looks like, and it becomes something that is part of global history as well as American national history, and sets the terms of what counts as destructiveness in a whole new way.